The woman ahead of you in the checkout line is somewhere near 49. Canvas tote, a cardigan that has clearly been through the wash more than 100 times, store-brand coffee on the belt. She pays with a debit card. She does not look at the screen when it asks if she wants to round up for charity. She just taps yes and keeps moving. Two people behind her, someone is performing a very different life. Newer everything. The bag that costs more than most car payments. The kind of effortlessness that takes a lot of effort to maintain. If you had to guess which of them was quietly worth more than $1 million, you would probably guess wrong. That is the point. The woman in the cardigan is not behind. She is not catching up. She crossed the finish line a few years ago and never told anyone because telling people was never part of the plan. And here's the part that should bother you a little. She did not get there with a windfall or a rich husband or a startup that went big. She got there before 50 on an ordinary income, using 6 habits that live almost entirely inside her own head. Not in her budget, not in some app, in her head. The way she thinks about money is doing the heavy lifting, and it has been for 20 years, quietly, while everyone around her was busy looking the part. I want to be honest with you about something before we go further, because I am not going to sell you a fairy tale. Women, on average, are handed a harder version of this game. The pay is lower over a lifetime. The career gets interrupted for caregiving more often. Women live around 5 years longer than men, which sounds like a gift until you realize the money has to stretch 5 years further. The typical woman reaches her late 50s with a fraction of what the typical man has saved. So, when I talk about the women who built wealth quietly before 50, I am not saying it was easy, and I am not going to pretend the gap is just a mindset problem. It isn't. But that is exactly why these mental habits matter so much. When the system gives you less margin for error, the way you think about money stops being a personality trait and starts being the whole strategy. And the strangest thing about these habits is that none of them are about earning more. Not one. The woman in the cardigan was never the highest earner in any room she walked into. She just refused to let her income decide how she lived. She refused to let a feeling sign a receipt. And she refused to perform a level of wealth she had not actually reached yet. Because she understood something most people spend their whole lives getting backwards. Wealth that has to be seen is usually still being paid for. Sit with that one, because it is the thread that runs through all 6 habits. The visible version of money, the part you can photograph, is almost always financed. The real version is invisible by design. It is sitting in an index fund nobody talks about at dinner. So here is what we are going to do. I am going to walk you through the 6 mental habits these women shared, in a specific order, because they build on each other. The first one is the one almost everyone gets wrong, and it has nothing to do with how much you spend. It has to do with what you think spending is for. The 6th one is the one that quietly made all the others worth it. And I will be honest with you. It is the one I wish someone had told me at 30. Let me show you the first. The first habit sounds soft. It is anything but. She stopped treating money like a mood. Most people, when they pull out a card, think they are buying a thing. The mug, the dress, the takeout, the little reward. What they are actually buying almost every time is a small change in how they feel for the next 20 minutes. The mug is a thing. The transaction is a feeling. The woman who built quiet wealth figured this out early. Not because she read it in a book, because one Friday night, sometime in her late 20s, she watched herself add 3 items to a cart that she had not wanted at all that morning. She had wanted to feel less invisible at her job. The cart was just where that feeling went. She did not stop buying things. That is not the habit. The habit is that she stopped letting the feeling do the buying. When the urge showed up, she let it sit there. Sometimes she still bought the thing. More often, she did not. The pause was not willpower. The pause was just noticing. I want you to hear what I am not saying, because this is where the message usually gets misread. I am not saying there is something morally superior about not buying things. I am not saying every purchase is a coping mechanism. Sometimes you really do need a new pair of shoes. The point is not denial. The point is that some portion of what most of us charge to a card in a given month is not buying the object. It is buying a small repair to how we feel. When you can see that clearly, you can still buy the object. You just stop being surprised when it does not fix anything for very long. That is habit 1. Money stops being a feeling and starts being an instruction. The instruction can still say yes. It just has to be an instruction, not a reflex. The second habit is what she did with all the wealth she stopped accidentally spending. The version of this you have probably heard sounds like a moral lesson. Rich people drive old cars. They live in modest houses. End of story. That is true and incomplete. It is not really about the car. What she figured out is something a little stranger. Once you start looking even slightly wealthy in your circle quietly recalibrates around you. The dinners get more expensive, the gifts get bigger, the vacations get harder to opt out of. The invitations themselves start to assume a level of disposable income, and saying no starts to feel like a small social failure. Visible wealth is a tax that other people charge you. So she paid the tax once, for a few months in her early 30s, after a promotion, the new car, the slightly nicer restaurants, the going along with things. And she watched her savings rate quietly collapse, not because she was buying expensive things for herself, but because she was being treated as someone who could. She stopped. Not all at once, and not as a statement. She just stopped answering the questions. When someone asked what she paid for her place, she would say a vague number on the low end. When someone asked what she made, she would change the subject. She let people assume she was doing fine, not great. She let her car get old. She let her clothes be perfectly nice and not new. None of it was about deprivation. It was about not getting reclassified into a more expensive bracket of friendship. The objection I always hear here is, isn't that just hiding who you are? And the honest answer is no. The visible version was the hiding. The visible version was performing a level of comfort she had not actually reached. Going quiet was the part where she stopped pretending. A researcher named Thomas Stanley, who studied American millionaires in the 1990s, and whose daughter expanded that work with a follow-up study of around 600 millionaires in 2018, found that most American millionaires did not look like millionaires. They drove ordinary cars, lived in ordinary neighborhoods, and made a quiet point of not being noticed. He called the opposite, the people who looked rich without being rich, big hat, no cattle. I will be honest about the limits of that finding. The data gets oversold. Not every quiet person is wealthy, and not every flashy person is broke. The research is a tendency, not a law. But the tendency is real, and it is real for a reason. People who are still trying to look rich usually still need the world to confirm something for them. People who are quietly wealthy usually stop needing that confirmation around the time they realized how expensive it was. That is habit 2. Invisibility is not modesty. It is math. The third habit is the one that lets the first 2 habits survive a bad week. Every wealth-building plan you have ever read assumes a version of you that wakes up disciplined every morning, every month for 30 years. That version of you does not exist. Mine does not either. The woman who built quiet wealth figured out the same thing in her 30s, and her response was not to try harder. It was to remove herself from the decision entirely. On payday, before she ever saw the money, a transfer went out. Retirement account first. Then a separate account she did not link to her debit card. Then bills. Then what was left lived in checking. By the time her brain had a chance to feel rich for a weekend, the wealth building had already happened that month automatically without consulting her mood. This sounds boring. It is boring. That is the entire point. The most powerful financial decisions are the ones you only have to make once. You set up the transfer once, you set the contribution rate once, you set the index fund once. After that, every paycheck for the next 20 years is a vote you already cast, on a day when you were paying attention instead of being asked to vote again every Friday night. There is a small detail here that matters more than it sounds like. She never raised her checking account ceiling. When her income went up, she raised the automatic transfer first and let what hit checking stay roughly the same. The raise went to the savings side of the wall before lifestyle even saw it. That is not frugality. That is engineering. The objection I want to handle is the one you are probably thinking. What if I cannot save much yet? That is fine. The point is not the percentage. The point is the architecture. Even $50 a paycheck, automated, builds the muscle. The muscle is what makes the percentage rise later possible. That is habit 3. Make the right move the default move. Stop relying on a version of yourself that has a great month every month, which sets up the habit that quietly did more for her account than any of the first 3. I want to show you a piece of data here, because this one is not opinion. It is measured. A study by Fidelity, looking at about 5.2 million customer accounts over a 10-year stretch from 2011 to 2020, found that on average, women investors outperformed men by about 0.4% per year. Vanguard found that women logged into their accounts roughly half as often as men and traded around 40% less. An older but well-known study by 2 University of California researchers, Barber and Odian, found that men traded about 45% more than women. The excess trading cost them. The more they touched their accounts, the worse they did. I want to be careful with this because people love to turn it into women are just better investors. That is not what the data says. The data says people who trade less and react less tend to do better over time. Women on average trade less, so women on average do better. The mechanism is patience, not gender. A man who behaves the same way gets the same result. A woman who panic trades gets the same result a man does. But here is why it matters for the women who built wealth quietly before 50. When the market dropped in 2020, then again in 2022, they did not log in. They did not move things around. They did not look at their balance for weeks. They had set up the boring index fund, the automatic transfer, the long horizon, and they let the storm pass over the top of it. Every time their friends moved things into cash because this time feels different. They did nothing. Doing nothing is one of the hardest investment decisions there is. Compounding is not magic, and that line gets thrown around so much, it has stopped meaning anything. The actual mechanism is simpler and a little disappointing. Money grows when it is left alone. The hand that interrupts is what stops the growth. So the habit, more than anything else, was the habit of not interrupting. That is habit 4. Patience is not a personality trait. It is a system you build by removing the buttons. A short pause here, because I have to be honest with you about something. If you are listening to this, and you are 43 or 46 and the number in your retirement account is not what you wish it were, I do not want you to feel like the woman in the cardigan is some kind of moral verdict on you. She is not. The Federal Reserve's most recent full survey of household finances from 2022 put the median net worth of American households with a head between 45 and 54 at around $247,000. The average for that same age group was almost $1 million. That is not a typo. The reason the average is roughly 4 times the median is that a small number of very wealthy households pull every average upward. When you compare yourself to the average American at 45, you are mostly comparing yourself to people in the top 5%. The middle of the actual middle is much closer to you than the headlines suggest. So if you are behind that median, you are behind. That is true, but you are nowhere near as behind as the comparison content keeps telling you. And the habits we are talking about are exactly the ones that change the trajectory from this point forward, not the ones that judge you for the trajectory before now. 2 habits left. The fifth one is the one nobody warns you about. The sixth is the one that makes the other five worth the trouble. Habit 5 is small. It sounds boring. It quietly does more work than any other one in this list. She knew her own numbers, not vaguely, not the way most people kind of know their finances. She could tell you, off the top of her head, what her net worth was, what her annual savings rate was, what was sitting in her retirement account, what her fixed costs were, and what her monthly burn looked like. None of these were complicated numbers. She just knew them. The reason this matters is the part most people get wrong. Across decades of research, the households that build wealth tend to spend more time looking at their own money than the households that do not. The exact number of hours varies by study, and I would not bet on a specific figure, but the direction is consistent. The people building wealth are looking at their own money more often, not the markets. Their own money. The other half of this habit is what she refused to do. She refused to be the person in a couple who did not know what was going on. There is a quiet, very persistent pattern in financial research where, when couples decide together, the husband often handles the investing decisions and the wife often handles the day-to-day budget. Years later, when something happens to that marriage, by death or divorce, the woman frequently discovers she does not actually know what she owns. That is not a small problem. It is the central financial vulnerability that produces the gap I described at the start. So she made it boring. Once a month, 20 minutes, a single document, net worth, savings rate, 3 or 4 numbers she wanted to track. That was it. No app, no system, just the discipline of looking. Most people in this spot tell me they do not understand any of this stuff. I want to be honest. Most of the women I have watched build wealth did not understand any of it either when they started. They learned 3 words a year. 20 years later, they knew enough. The literacy did not come first. The looking came first, and the literacy followed. That is habit 5. If you cannot say the numbers out loud, you do not actually own the wealth. You are just hoping it is there, which brings us to the last habit, the one I told you about at the start. The 6th habit is the reason the first 5 worked. She thought in decades. When she was 32 and her friends were upgrading apartments, she was running a different calculation in her head. Not, can I afford this rent? A longer one. The kind of calculation that asks what an extra $100 or $200 a month invested instead of spent would do over 30 years. Not a year. 30. Let me put a number on it, and let me be careful about how I do it. If you invest $200 a month and you assume an average annual return of about 8% over a long period, which is roughly what a diversified U.S. stock index has historically delivered but is never guaranteed, then after 25 years that $200 a month grows to somewhere around $190,000. After 40 years, it grows to roughly $700,000. Same contribution. The only thing that changed was time. That is not a trick. It is just what numbers do when they are left alone long enough. Most people think about money in pay periods. The women who built wealth quietly think in decades. When they make a financial decision, they are not really deciding whether they can afford something next month. They are deciding what they are giving the next 10 years permission to look like. There is one more piece to this habit, and it is the part that is specifically true for women. Women in the United States live, on average, around 5 years longer than men. That means a woman planning for retirement is not actually planning for the same retirement her brother is. She is planning for a retirement that may last 25 or 30 years, in a body that may need care, in a country where healthcare in old age is not cheap. The math is just bigger. Most retirement advice does not say that out loud. The women who built wealth quietly said it to themselves early. They did not retire from their 30s. They invested for a 30-year retirement, starting around 65, with a buffer for a body they had not met yet. That extra time was not a curse. It was a planning constraint they took seriously while their peers were still arguing about whether to lease or buy. A projection from McKinsey, the consulting firm, estimates that by 2030, American women will control somewhere around $34 trillion in investable assets, roughly 38% of the U.S. total. That is partly because of inheritance from longer-lived spouses, and partly because women are increasingly the ones making the household financial decisions. It is going to be the largest gender wealth shift in American history. The women who built quietly before 50 are the ones who will know what to do with it, because they were already paying attention. That is habit 6. Count in decades, plan for a longer life, and let time do the work that effort never could. Here is what to do on Monday morning when no one is watching. You have heard 6 habits. Stop letting a feeling sign a receipt. Go quiet on purpose. Make the right move the default move. Make patience the system. Refuse to outsource the math. Count in decades. If you try to install all 6 this week, you will install none of them. I have watched that happen too many times to pretend otherwise. People leave a video like this lit up, and by Wednesday, they have alphabetized their cabinets and not changed a single financial decision. That is not a discipline problem. That is an architecture problem. So I am going to ask you to do exactly one thing, and I am going to make it small enough that it would be embarrassing not to do it. This Sunday night, 20 minutes, 1 piece of paper, or 1 document on your phone. Same thing. Write down 4 numbers. What you are worth, roughly. Everything you own minus everything you owe. Be honest, be approximate. Nobody is going to grade it. What percentage of your income you actually save right now? Not what you wish you saved. What you save. What your fixed costs are. The bills that show up whether you want them to or not. What you spend in a typical month on top of those bills. 4 numbers, 20 minutes. That is it. You are not solving anything in that 20 minutes. You are just doing the one thing the woman in the cardigan started doing at 30 and kept doing for the next 20 years. Then, and only then, pick one of the 6 habits and make exactly 1 move from it. Not 6. 1. The most common right answer is habit 3. Automate 1 transfer that did not exist before this video. Even $50. Even $20. The amount is not the point. The architecture is the point. That is the whole assignment. Here is what to remember on the days you forget everything else. The woman in the checkout line at the start of this video did not get there by being smarter than you. She did not have a secret. She did not have a windfall. She had 6 small decisions she made once that kept making themselves quietly in the background for 20 years. She was paying attention to numbers most of her friends had decided were too boring to track. She was refusing to perform a level of wealth she had not actually reached. And by the time anyone could have called her wealthy, she had already stopped needing the word. Quiet wealth is not a personality. It is a series of small refusals that compound into a life that does not require an audience. You are not behind because you are bad with money. You are not behind because the women I have been describing are smarter than you. You are behind, if you are behind at all, because nobody told you that the visible version of money is almost always the financed version. The real version is invisible by design, sitting in an account most people forget exists, growing on a schedule that does not care whether you remember it this week. Open the document, write the 4 numbers, set the 1 transfer, then close the laptop and go to bed. The future you is already waiting for the email to come through.